My name is Eleanor Calloway. I'm 65, retired, and after decades of balancing ledgers and spreadsheets, I thought I had mastered the art of control. I like precision, quiet mornings with coffee, and the subtle rhythm of my small Boise apartment. Yet, that Tuesday morning, as I sorted the mail, a crisp envelope with familiar handwriting caught my eye. It was from Lila, my daughter. The return address made my chest tighten. Thanksgiving invitations from her family were always wrapped in pleasantries, layered over expectations. I slid open the envelope carefully, my fingers brushing against a cream-colored card. Inside, in neat cursive, it read, "We'd love for you to join us for Thanksgiving. Your presence is requested." A flicker of warmth stirred, memories of shared laughter. The smell of roasted turkey and the smell of cinnamon from pies filled my mind, but just as quickly, a shadow of doubt crossed me. Lila's invitations had a pattern. There was always a reason behind the smile, a debt, a favor, a subtle pressure wrapped in familial love. I folded the card back into the envelope and set it on the counter, staring at the pale morning light spilling across the hardwood floor. My apartment felt unusually quiet, almost complicit in my hesitation. I thought of all the Thanksgivings I had attended, each a rehearsal in patience, each a test I had passed without acknowledgement. And yet, some part of me, stubborn as ever, wanted to believe. I tucked the envelope into my purse, set my keys beside it, and took a deep breath. The decision to go was made. Though unease lingered, I allowed myself a moment to imagine the familiar scents, the chatter, and the holiday lights. Then, with a small shake of my head, I reminded myself that preparation was everything. Tomorrow would require more than just hope, it would require strategy. I spent the morning arranging gifts on the small table by the window, letting sunlight spill over neatly wrapped packages and carefully folded scarves. Each item felt heavier than its weight suggested, not because of their material value, but because of the memories entwined with them. A wool scarf I had bought months ago reminded me of Lila's laughter when she was 10, and how I had stayed up late finishing her science project, even after a 12-hour day at the office. That same diligence had earned me little more than a polite nod from my parents. As I folded a sweater, I remembered my teenage years nights spent balancing homework with chores, silent dinners where my own accomplishments went unnoticed, and the way Lila's grades were celebrated with ribbons and praise that felt almost performative. I had learned early that being responsible was my ticket to survival in this household, but recognition was rare. I had learned to swallow my pride, to appear cheerful while being overlooked, and to quietly carry burdens that were never mine. The envelope from yesterday rested on the counter like a warning. I tried to push it aside, but my thoughts kept returning to the patterned expectations, the subtle reminders that my worth was measured not in love, but in utility. I thought of the dinners past, the laughter that never included me, and the careful smiles that concealed judgment. Still, I wanted to believe tomorrow might be different, even if only slightly. I packed a small loaf of homemade bread. Remembering how Lila had once asked for a bite before anyone else could, I added a small bottle of wine, hoping it might soften the edges of tension. And finally, a card with carefully chosen words, though I doubted anyone would read them beyond the surface. I zipped my bag, taking a slow breath, letting the memories settle around me. Each item carried a piece of my past, some tender, some sharp, but all of them were mine to carry. Tomorrow, I would step into the house armed with them, both shield and story. The driveway stretched ahead, familiar yet strange, lined with maples shedding their amber leaves onto the concrete path. I parked the car and adjusted my coat, gripping my purse a little tighter than usual. The house looked the same, neat, welcoming from a distance. But the closer I got, the more I remembered the silent judgments that had always lingered behind its doors. As I stepped onto the porch, Lila appeared first, smiling widely. Her eyes, though, flickered with something calculated, a subtle measuring of my reaction. "Mom, you made it," she said, her voice light, almost rehearsed. I returned a smile, aware of the tension woven into her words. Inside, the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon hit me, stirring memories of happier times, of Thanksgiving dinners I had once anticipated with hope. My heart softened for a moment before wariness returned. My husband, Thomas, stood quietly by the kitchen, nodding as he offered a polite greeting. His presence was grounding, but even his calm could not mask the undercurrent of expectation in the room. My parents, Margaret and Henry, were seated in their usual chairs. Their smiles were gentle, but something in their eyes betrayed the old pattern attention skewed toward Lila. Subtle questions veiled as concern. Each handshake, each welcome, felt measured. I noticed the way Lila's husband lingered nearby, observing, subtly guiding the conversation. I handed over my gifts, noting the polite nods, the soft thanks that seemed as much performance as acknowledgement. The living room, so familiar, felt almost like a stage. I caught myself counting the seconds between comments, gauging pauses, and wondering how much of this warmth was genuine and how much was carefully scripted. Even in a place I knew well, I felt the isolation settle around me, a reminder that appearances could deceive. The house held memories of love and neglect, laughter and judgment, and I carried both with me as the door closed behind the last guest. The dining room smelled of roasted turkey and fresh herbs, a comforting aroma that should have made me relax. Plates gleamed under the soft chandelier light, and the table was set with all the trimmings. Each utensil aligned perfectly. I took a seat between Thomas and Margaret, the familiar weight of anticipation pressing on my shoulders. Conversation began with the usual greetings, questions about the weather, and comments on my drive from Boise. But as the small talk progressed, the tone shifted subtly. Lila leaned forward, her smile warm but calculated. "So, Mom, how are your investments doing this year? Any new opportunities you're exploring?" she asked casually. Yet each word carried a weight I could feel. I answered carefully, giving generalities and vague updates. But her eyes searched mine, measuring. Thomas offered a quiet nod of support, but even he didn't intervene, letting me navigate the probing questions on my own. The pattern was familiar, each polite inquiry a test, each compliment a veiled expectation. Margaret joined in, complimenting my career achievements, her voice gentle, almost approving, yet the praise felt strategic rather than affectionate. And my chest tightened. I realized how much had changed in this household. My accomplishments had never been mine alone. They were tools to be admired and leveraged. Lila's husband added his own remarks, praising my prudence and the discipline that allowed me to maintain savings and retirement plans. The words were soft, flattering, but sharpened with subtle insinuations. Each comment reminded me that my value was measured not in love or presence, but in stability and resources. I sipped water, feeling the cool liquid anchor me, while the conversation continued around financial strategies, retirement plans, and hypothetical investments. The laughter and clinking of cutlery masked the tension that had settled over the table like an invisible fog. Every polite phrase carried a hidden agenda, every compliment a question I had no intention of answering fully. By the time the first course arrived, I felt both fully present and entirely out of place. The table's warmth was a careful performance, a mask for expectations I had spent decades learning to meet, and the unease in my chest reminded me that appearances could be deceiving. The room had settled into the rhythm of polite chatter when Margaret handed me a small velvet box. Her hands careful, almost ceremonial. I took it, smiling politely, letting the warm light fall across its deep burgundy surface. Lila's eyes sparkled with a rehearsed excitement, and for a moment, I allowed myself to imagine something simple inside a trinket, a token of holiday goodwill. I lifted the lid and froze. Inside was no ornament, no keepsake, only a folded bank notice, the edges crisp and official. My heart thudded against my ribs as I read the words, Lila's debt, $250,000 overdue. I looked up, meeting her gaze. She smiled, calm, almost expectant. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with anticipation. My parents exchanged glances that spoke volumes without a word, and I realized immediately what they assumed I would cover it. My chest tightened, disbelief mixing with a cold wash of betrayal. This is yours, I asked, my voice smaller than usual, trembling slightly despite my best effort to stay composed. Your sister's debt, Margaret said gently, her tone soft, but the message was sharp as a blade. You'll cover this. I stared at the notice, my fingers gripping the edges. The weight of expectation, decades in the making, pressed down on me. Years of silent responsibility, careful planning, and personal sacrifice had always been noted, silently stored, and now weaponized. The polite atmosphere of the dinner had dissolved into something calculated, a test I had not agreed to take. I placed the box carefully back on the table, forcing my hands to steady themselves. This was no gift. It was a trap, perfectly wrapped in tradition and family obligation. The realization settled in with a chill. I had walked into a performance that had been rehearsed long before I arrived. I took a slow, steadying breath and set the bank notice aside. I can't cover this, I said, my voice firm, trying to maintain control over the storm rising in my chest. The words hung in the air, deliberate and final. Lila's smile faltered for the briefest instant before it hardened. You'll do it, she said sharply, leaning forward. Her hand swept a glass of red wine across the table, and the liquid arced through the air, splashing cold and sticky across my face and neck. Shock froze me for a heartbeat. The warm, celebratory glow of the chandelier seemed to mock the stinging mess dripping down my blouse. Unbelievable, Margaret murmured, her voice calm but edged with expectation. We thought you would help. You're doing so well. And this is how families handle things. Henry's gaze flicked between us, a silent nudge urging compliance, his tone hidden beneath polite concern. The room felt smaller, suffocating, each family member's eyes calculating, weighing my response. Lila leaned back, arms crossed, satisfaction faintly painted across her features. Her husband watched quietly, passive yet approving of the display. I wiped at the wine with trembling hands, the warmth of anger and humiliation rising, decades of being measured, tested, and overlooked pressed down with renewed intensity. This was no longer a polite expectation. It was a demand, wrapped in the guise of tradition and familial obligation. My own history, my careful management of finances, and my sacrifices were now being wielded against me, tools in a performance I hadn't agreed to join. The clatter of cutlery and murmured conversation continued around me, but I heard none of it. Every polite phrase was a weapon, every smile a challenge. I felt disbelief, anger, and a surge of protective instinct coiling in my chest. I would not be used, not now, not ever. The velvet box, the wine, the carefully orchestrated pressures, they would not break me. I straightened my shoulders, lifted my chin, and let the silence settle between us. The scene crackled with tension, and I knew the moment had arrived I had to stand firm, or the boundaries I had fought for all my life would vanish in a heartbeat. I hadn't noticed Thomas slip quietly into the corner of the room, his hands folded loosely in front of him, eyes sharp and alert. He had watched me as I faced the volley of demands, the polite pressure that masked coercion. For a moment, the chaos around the table seemed to pause, the hum of conversation fading beneath the gravity of his gaze. He saw everything. The way Lila leaned back, satisfied with her display, the careful smiles of Margaret and Henry, veiling their expectations like a practiced routine, the subtle nods from Lila's husband, affirming the performance, each detail of the manipulation, each nuance of entitlement, registered clearly in his steady eyes. I caught his glance briefly, a quiet reassurance. His presence anchored me, offering a sense that I was not entirely alone. Even as my heart pounded and humiliation lingered in the sticky scent of red wine, I felt a shift. Thomas's observant calm carved a small space of clarity amid the storm of judgment and expectation. He didn't speak, didn't intervene immediately, but the energy he brought altered the room. The pressure I had been shouldering, the weight of decades of responsibility and invisible debt, felt slightly less suffocating. His silent attention made the family's subtle manipulations more visible, their coercion exposed in the quiet accountability of his watchful stance. I straightened in my chair, letting my spine take in some of the strength radiating from him. The velvet box, the wine, the rehearsed questions, they still hung heavily over the table, but now I sensed that the imbalance might be challenged. Thomas had noticed the pattern, the entitlement, the exploitation. His presence hinted that someone could intervene, that the truth might yet surface. The room continued its careful performance. Unaware that their choreography had been seen through, I allowed myself a cautious breath, knowing that hope had returned, thin and tentative, but real. Thomas finally spoke, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Enough," he said, turning to the table with a weight that made everyone pause. "Eleanor is not responsible for this debt." The words hung in the air, clear and uncompromising. I felt a flicker of relief, though the adrenaline still pulsed through my veins. Lila's expression faltered, a shadow crossing her carefully rehearsed smile. Thomas continued, enumerating the details I had long suspected but had never been voiced aloud: trips to Paris, a new BMW, casino excursions, luxury purchases, all funded through mismanagement, hidden behind accounts I had no access to. His tone was steady, exposing the misdirection without theatrics. My parents shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, the gentle veneer of politeness cracking under the weight of accountability. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it again. Henry's hand tightened around his cane, a subtle acknowledgement that the balance had shifted. The table's quiet had changed. The carefully maintained hierarchy wavered under Thomas's observation. I sat back, letting the truth wash over me. The velvet box, the bank notice, the wine, they had all been tools in a performance designed to coerce me. But now, with Thomas articulating what had been hidden, the moral clarity of the situation became undeniable. I was not the target, nor the enabler. Lila's mismanagement and the family's assumptions had been exposed, and the room could no longer ignore it. Even Lila's husband, usually composed, showed a flicker of doubt. Glancing between her and Thomas, the quiet shock that settled across the table was tangible. Eyes avoided mine, and the expectation that I would conform had evaporated. I took a slow breath, tasting freedom in its raw, tentative form. The power that had been wielded against me, the invisible chains of obligation, guilt, and pressure was loosened. For the first time that evening, I could see a path forward without compromising my integrity, without being used as collateral for someone else's recklessness. The room held its breath, and I realized that the tide had turned. The truth had been spoken, and for the first time, I was no longer trapped within their expectations. I straightened my shoulders and let my gaze sweep across the table, meeting each family member's eyes without flinching. The weight of expectation had lifted slightly now that the truth had been exposed, and I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in decades. "I will not cover this debt," I said evenly, letting the words settle firmly in the room. "It is not mine to pay, and I will not be manipulated into taking responsibility for another's choices." Lila's face paled, her carefully maintained composure faltering. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, and Henry shifted in his chair, the cane tapping softly against the floor. Silence spread like a tangible presence. For a moment, the room seemed suspended, as if waiting to see whether I would falter. Thomas reached out, a quiet reassurance, resting a hand briefly on my arm. His steady presence gave me courage. I could feel the subtle tremors of power shifting. The authority that had long rested on guilt and obligation was fracturing. Lila's husband glanced away, avoiding confrontation. While Lila's fingers tightened on the edge of her chair, I allowed myself to speak with the calm confidence I had carried in private for years. "I will participate in family events on my terms. I will offer my presence and my care, but I will not be used as a solution, a financial resource, or a pawn." The words rang with honesty, unyielding yet measured. Responses came in quiet murmurs. Some faces reflected shame, others anger, and a few acknowledged the truth with reluctant acceptance. I noticed Margaret's nod, subtle but genuine, and Henry's gaze softened just enough to show recognition of my autonomy. For the first time, I felt the boundaries of my life firmly in my own hands. I had reclaimed a measure of control and confidence, and the relief was almost dizzying. The room could adjust around me now, but I knew this was the moment I had to hold steady. My choices, my terms, and my dignity were no longer negotiable. The drive back to Boise felt quieter than usual, the streets familiar yet reframed by the events of the evening. The winter air pressed gently against the car windows, crisp and clean, carrying a sense of finality. I carried a calm I had not known in years, tempered by the adrenaline that had surged through me at the dinner table. At home, I unpacked slowly, placing each item in its designated spot. The apartment seemed to breathe around me, reflecting a life I had built on my own terms. I checked my accounts, adjusting passwords and reorganizing finances, securing the boundaries I had established not just verbally, but practically. The velvet box now returned to its drawer, felt inert, a symbol of an obligation I had refused to carry. I sank into the armchair by the window, Thomas settling quietly beside me, his presence steady. I thought of the dinner, of Lila's anger, of the polite masks of my parents, and felt a surprising surge of clarity. For decades, I had measured my worth against their approval, but tonight had proved that autonomy and dignity were not granted, they were claimed. The apartment smelled faintly of brewed coffee and cedar from the small planter by the sill. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the dark, and I realized that my sense of family, of love, did not depend solely on approval or presence. It could be redefined, tempered by choice, mutual respect, and honesty. I allowed myself to smile, small and private. The weight of obligation had lifted, replaced by the steady pulse of self-respect. I had learned that walking away from manipulation did not diminish love. It clarified it. I had redrawn the lines around my life. And in doing so, I had reclaimed the joy of being fully, unapologetically myself. Thomas reached for my hand, and I felt the warmth of partnership and understanding in that quiet space. I recognized the first moments of renewal peace born not of avoidance, but of empowered choice.